As the push for impeachment on Capitol Hill intensifies, the process is also bringing a renewed focus to Congress. The legislative body charged with the power to impeach a sitting president has long been a punchline for ineffectiveness. Chief political correspondent at Politico magazine, Tim Alberta, has a new article titled "When Impeachment Meets a Broken Congress." He says the most essential branch of the U.S. government is collapsing before our eyes, right as it faces a historic showdown. And Tim Alberta joins me now from Arlington, Virginia, to discuss it. Tim, thank you so much for being with us. Why is the legislative branch struggling to function?
Well, that's a loaded question with a long answer. The short version of the answer is that you have systemic problems in the United States Congress, starting with the personnel at the member level. The people we send to Congress are generally not people who you want writing your laws. And the reason that we wind up with so many folks in Congress who don't belong there is because they come from districts that are drawn in a way that punishes bipartisanship and rewards brinksmanship. And what you eventually wind up with after you filter out all of the good, competent, pragmatic, reasonable people who want to come to Congress and solve problems, they can't keep their seats for very long approaching the job that way. So they either lose or they throw up their hands and they walk away and they say, this place is broken, it can't be fixed, and I don't want to be here anymore. And so you always have an incoming crop of freshman congressmen every 2 years who say that they're going to change the place and that they're not going to adhere to the status quo. But ultimately, they wind up getting swallowed alive by the status quo, and their decision is whether to go along with it and hold on to their jobs and keep their $174,000 a year paycheck and their staff of 20 waiting on them hand and foot and all these other lovely perks for a very important job, or they get sick and tired of it and they throw up their hands and they go home. Either way, the end result is the same, that Congress continues to be dysfunctional. It was dysfunctional before Donald Trump came into office. It's dysfunctional now. It will probably be dysfunctional in 10 years.
So to follow up, Virginia Democratic freshman Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger told you, quote, even in the most basic relationship forming aspect of things, there's this division, and it becomes clear that you're supposed to be divided. What more can you tell us about how Congress's setup inherently encourages division?
Yeah, and it was interesting. Congresswoman Spanberger was talking about how when she arrived for freshman orientation, how they herded the Republicans freshmen onto one bus and the Democratic freshmen onto another bus, and how as the week ensued, basically all of these activities that they were undertaking were divided. It was a shirts and skins, Sunni versus Shia exercise. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're trying to build personal relationships with people that can help inform your professional relationships, then that's a bad way to start. And you wouldn't do that in any kind of other workplace.
No, absolutely. Well, Congress has been called broken long before President Trump, but what impact do you think this presidency has had on the institution?
Well, there's no question that when the president is such a polarizing figure and when he is presiding over such a deeply fractured and tribalized country, that the elected officials on Capitol Hill are going to respond in kind. Republicans on Capitol Hill have circled the wagons and rallied around this president even when he has done things or said things that would be beyond the pale of coming from a Democratic president. And Democrats have jumped down the president's throats at times, even when he is attempting to do something that there should be bipartisan support for. One of the things that Congresswoman Spanberger talked about in the article is how there was a bipartisan bill to lower prescription drug costs that came out of committee on a bipartisan vote. It was set to clear the House of Representatives on a bipartisan vote, but her party's leadership, Nancy Pelosi and the House Democratic leadership, they put a poison pill into that bill that stopped it from passing on the House floor. And it's her belief that House Democratic leaders did that to prevent Donald Trump from getting a political victory. Now, that's not something you would blame Trump for, but it certainly is part and parcel of a political culture that is built around a bifurcated electorate, and Donald Trump, more than anybody else, has contributed to that. So Congress is less functional now than it was before Trump came into office, but again, that's not saying a whole lot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question a lot of people have is, given this landscape that you just spelled out there, laid out for us, can this hyper-partisanship get even worse as lawmakers continue down the path of impeachment?
Oh, it can absolutely get worse. Typically, the question that people ask is, how does this get better? How do we fix it? And I will just be honest with you and say, I don't think it does get better. I think we're through the looking glass in a lot of respects, but it can absolutely get worse, and I'll tell you how it can get worse. Even setting impeachment aside, what you have now is an electorate across the country that is clustering itself. It is self-selecting into its own ideological and geographic and demographic echo chambers. And if those patterns persist, the type of districts that we see drawn today and the way that these maps are gerrymandered, it's going to get a whole lot worse. And there's nothing that any sort of good government reform group can really do about that necessarily, because it's not just that the lawmakers are drawing these people into their own silos, it's that the people are choosing those silos for themselves. This country is growing apart from itself at a rate that we've never seen before, and there's no sign that it's going to abate anytime soon.
So you spoke to the two lawmakers in charge of the Select Committee to study Congress's structural breakdowns. How are they going after this problem?
You know, these are two gentlemen who I think are very sincere about trying to fix Congress, and they recognize that there is no silver bullet, that Congress is not going to be reformed, it's not going to be repaired by some sweeping catch-all bill, and there's certainly not going to be some amendment to the Constitution or any sort of a ballot initiative at a state-by-state level that's going to begin to clean this place up. What they're looking at are sort of the small fixes that they can make to the institution that can begin to repair some of the damage that's been done from the inside out. So they're focused on things like staff retention. It's a major problem on Capitol Hill when you attract a bright young individual fresh out of their master's program to come work for your staff, and they have been invaluable in helping to draft legislation and helping to move a procedural argument along to passage, and suddenly they get a $300,000 a year job dangled in front of them, and they leave. After having only been on Capitol Hill for 3 or 4 years, they leave because who wouldn't want to have their salary tripled and do half the work for it? And obviously, that's a major problem. There is a personnel problem that just is pervasive in Congress, and it starts at the member level, but the staff problem is almost as important. So that's something that they're trying to address in this Select Committee. But again, frankly, that is just sort of at the periphery of Congress's dysfunction. And some of the other things they're looking at, too, as well as, technology in some of the committees they feel like is outdated. They need to improve that. These are things that are to be commended. They are trying to take some bite-sized chunks out of this dysfunction, but they're not going to get very far, because ultimately, until you tackle some of these big systemic problems with the institution, the rest of it doesn't really matter.
All right. Well, it's an incredibly bleak picture that you paint, Tim, Alberta, but hopefully at least discussing some of these structural issues, perhaps shedding light on them might begin to make a difference.